The story begins not in battlefields or courts of war, but in the quiet of a royal garden. It was a place meant for beauty, not for blood. Stone fountains whispered against the air, and jasmine vines clung to the walls like secrets too heavy to let go. In the middle of it all, a young queen walked in silence. She was watched by many, yet understood by none. Among the servants who passed through these grounds was a man without rank, without wealth, but with words that could cut deeper than any blade. He was a poet named in the official records, erased by those who wanted his story buried, yet whispers still echo. He once dared to love the queen. This was not the kind of love painted in ballads or sung by court musicians. It was hidden in fragments, lines of verse tucked beneath tapestries, notes etched into the margins of books, the kind of words too dangerous to be spoken aloud. For in kingdoms of old, a queen's heart did not belong to her, was chained to power, to alliances, to kings who ruled with iron hands. To reach for her was to reach for death itself. But the poet did not stop. His words bled through the cracks of the palace walls. He wrote of her beauty, but also of her loneliness. He described the way her smile trembled when the crown was heavy, the way her eyes turned to the horizon, as if searching for freedom. For a woman trapped by duty, the poet's verses were the only mirror that reflected her soul. No one knows how she responded. Some say she never looked at him, never dared to acknowledge the man who risked everything for a single glance. Others insist she left secret tokens behind a pressed flower, folded ribbon, small enough to deny but powerful enough to fuel rumors. What is certain is that their connection grew, and in a palace where loyalty meant survival, secrets like these were dangerous. It was only a matter of time before the words reached ears they were never meant to. A jealous courtier, a suspicious guard, or perhaps the king himself, sensing that his queen's heart was slipping into shadows. History does not agree on who betrayed the poet, but betrayal came all the same. When the whispers grew too loud, the punishment was swift. Love, they said, was not his crime. His words were, "A king could not allow a servant's tongue to shape stories of a queen." And so, in the cruelest silence of all, they sentenced the poet to lose the very thing that made him powerful, his voice. But the question remains, how did a forbidden love turn into one of history's most haunting acts of vengeance? Palaces are built on silence, but silence is never empty. Behind every gilded wall, servants whispered. Guards exchanged glances. Courtiers carried half-truths like poisoned daggers, waiting for the right moment to strike. And in that world, the poet's verses could not remain hidden for long. At first, they seemed harmless. Few scraps of parchment tucked beneath a cushion, a verse scratched into a clay jug. But these words were different from the usual poems of loyalty sung in the court. They spoke not of kings or conquests, but of a queen's hidden sorrow. They praised not her crown, but her smile. They honored not her throne, but her heart. For those who lived in fear of kings, such words were dangerous because they were true. One night, a guard found a folded parchment left near the queen's chambers. Its ink had not yet dried. On it was written a verse so intimate that no one could mistake its meaning. Her eyes hold storms the kingdom will never see. Her silence is louder than the throne's decree. The guard hesitated. Should he burn it and say nothing? Or should he take it to the captain, knowing what rewards loyalty could bring? Fear won. The parchment was delivered, and by dawn the poet's fate was sealed. The court buzzed with whispers. Who dared to write such lines? Who risked their life to speak of the queen as if she were a woman, not a crown? At first, suspicion spread like wildfire. Servants were questioned, scholars interrogated, and musicians watched with suspicion. Yet the poet's style was unmistakable. His words carried a rhythm, a weight, a wound. Those who had read his works in taverns or on temple walls knew exactly who had written it. The queen herself said nothing. History does not tell us if she denied, if she pleaded, or if she sat in silence, letting the world decide. But silence in a court is dangerous. It can be mistaken for guilt. By the second night, the poet was dragged from his quarters. His ink-stained hands betrayed him. His writings, hidden beneath loose floorboards, were gathered as evidence. He was not accused of treason, nor of plotting against the king. His crime was far more unforgivable. He had given the queen something the king never could, words of love. The punishment was whispered even before it was spoken. They would not kill him. Death was too quick, too merciful. Instead, they would take from him the very weapon that had wounded the crown, his tongue. The poet, still in chains, looked at the queen one last time. Did their eyes meet? Did she turn away? Or did she hold his gaze with the weight of unspoken sorrow? No one can agree. But one thing is certain. From that night, the palace that once echoed with his verses would soon fall into a silence that no song could break. The poet was led into the courtyard before dawn, when shadows still clung to the walls like fearful children. No royal trumpet announced his trial. No scroll of law was read. His sentence was not a matter of justice, but of power. The guards tied his hands behind his back and forced him to his knees. A crowd had gathered not the noble court in their silks and jewels, but the ones who had no choice, servants, soldiers, slaves, and whispering courtiers, who pretended they came only to obey. All of them stood in silence, as if the very air was waiting for what was about to happen. At the center, the king appeared. His robe dragged against the stone floor, his crown heavy with jewels. He did not shout, did not rage, did not even accuse. His voice was calm, cold, like a blade pressed against the skin. "You gave her words," he said. "Now you will have none." The poet did not beg. He did not plead for his life. Those who witnessed it said he only lowered his head, as if surrendering not to the king but to fate itself. He had written too much, felt too deeply, risked too far to believe his story would end in mercy. A man stepped forward, carrying the Tula-curved blade glinting in the torchlight. The punishment was simple, brutal, and unforgettable. The crowd gasped. Some turned away, others leaned forward, desperate to remember every detail for the stories they would later whisper. The poet opened his mouth, perhaps to speak one last verse, perhaps to call her name. But before sound could escape, the blade struck. It was not a clean silence. It was a silence filled with blood. The poet fell forward, choking, his cries reduced to a guttural sound that no longer carried meaning. The crowd recoiled. Even those loyal to the king felt the weight of what they had witnessed. To cut out a tongue was not simply punishment, it was erasure. It was the deliberate killing of memory, of words, of song. Some said the queen watched from behind a lattice window, her face hidden in shadow. Did she weep? Did she turn away? Or did she stand frozen, trapped between crown and heart? History leaves us no answer, only silence. When it was over, the poet lay in chains, bleeding but alive. Alive, yet robbed of the very thing that made him human. The king returned to his chambers, believing he had destroyed the man who dared to love his queen. But cruelty often plants seeds of legend. The poet, voiceless, became something far more dangerous than the king ever expected. A living symbol. The king believed silence would bury the poet, yet silence has a way of speaking louder than words. In the weeks that followed the punishment, the palace did not grow quieter. It grew restless. The servants who once moved in fear of the king's gaze now whispered of the man who had loved the queen so deeply he paid for it with his tongue. Soldiers who carried out the sentence told the tale in hushed tones around campfires, each adding their own detail: the poet's calm, acceptance, the queen's unseen tears, the king's cold decree. The story spread beyond the walls. In taverns, in marketplaces, in the back rooms of temples, people repeated his verses from memory. The words he had written before his tongue was taken became weapons sharper than any sword. Farmers recited them under their breath, lovers scribbled them in the dirt. And for the first time, the people did not just see a king and queen, they saw a woman trapped by power, and a man punished for daring to love her. The poet himself became a ghost wandering the palace grounds. Unable to speak, he communicated with gestures, with scratches of chalk, with the hollow silence of his eyes. Those who saw him said his presence carried more weight than any words he had once written. He was living proof of the crown's cruelty. Every drop of blood that stained the courtyard now lived in his silence. The queen's role in this became more dangerous with each passing day, though she spoke no word of defense. Rumors claim she left food for him in the night. Some swore they saw her slip parchment to his quarters, though what could he do with it now? Others believed she met his gaze during court assemblies, a flicker of sorrow that the king pretended not to see. The king, however, saw enough. He had hoped to destroy a poet, but instead he had created a legend. Every tongue he cut could silence a man but not a story. and this story was growing beyond his reach. In response, the king tried to erase all traces of the poet's work. His writings were burned, his parchments destroyed, his inkpots shattered. Yet memory is harder to burn than paper. People who once dismissed poetry as trivial now carried his words like sacred scripture. Children learned his verses before they learned the king's decrees. Damn! It was a battle the crown could not win, a battle between fear and memory. And so, the silent poet lived on, neither free nor forgotten. But as his legend spread, another question began to haunt the people. If his love could not be killed by the king's cruelty, then what would the queen do next? The king had silenced the poet, but he had not silenced the queen's heart. For months, she endured the weight of the crown, smiling in public, praying in ceremonies, performing her duties like a figure carved from stone. Yet in the stillness of night, the absence of words echoed louder than the chants of priests or the songs of musicians. The poet's silence haunted her. Every time she saw him in the palace gardens, his mouth scarred, his eyes steady, she felt a truth she could not speak. He had given everything for a love she was forbidden to return. And though no one heard her admit it, the queen carried his suffering like a wound she could not hide. One night, during a royal feast, something unexpected happened. The king demanded entertainment. Musicians played, dancers twirled, jesters performed. But when a singer rose to recite verses, the queen interrupted. "Sing not of kings and crowns," she said softly, yet her voice carried through the hall. "Sing of truth." The court froze. Truth was dangerous in the presence of power. The singer, trembling, began to recite lines everyone thought had been destroyed, lines of the silent poet. Her eyes hold storms, the kingdom will never see. Her silence is louder than the throne's decree. Gasps rippled through the hall. The king's face turned dark, but the queen did not flinch. She sat with her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the poet who stood at the back of the hall, chained, voiceless, but alive. It was the closest thing to confession she could give. By allowing his words to be spoken in the king's presence, she risked everything. Her throne, her crown, even her life. Yet in that moment, the queen chose defiance. The twist was clear, though the poet had lost his tongue. It was the queen who gave him a voice again. The king erupted in rage. He ordered the singer whipped, the poet confined to the deepest chambers, and the queen herself was warned of treasonous sympathy, yet the damage had already been done. The court had seen it, the people had heard of it. And in kingdoms where gossip traveled faster than law, her defiance lit a fire that no blade could extinguish. Now, the story was no longer about a poet who loved a queen. It was about a queen who dared to answer that love, even if only in fragments of silence and stolen gestures. The legend grew darker, sharper. The king had tried to control the story, but now he was losing it. For the more he punished, the more the people remembered. And in the middle of it all, one truth remained. A man without a tongue had become louder than a king with a crown. For months, the silent poet remained chained within the palace walls, a living reminder of forbidden love. But as his story spread, questions began to rise. Who was he before he became legend? How did a man of such low station dare to write words that reached a queen's heart? The truth, buried beneath layers of secrecy, revealed a life shaped by tragedy. The poet had not been born a servant. He was once the son of a scholar, raised in halls filled with books and debate. His father had served the crown as a tutor, teaching young princes the language of philosophy and art. From childhood, the boy was surrounded by words, words of wisdom, words of faith, words that shaped kingdoms. But when his father fell out of favor with the court, the family's fortunes collapsed. Stripped of titles, they were cast aside. The boy was left with nothing but his father's ink-stained hands and the fire of learning in his soul. While others sought swords to climb their way back into power, he clung to poetry. By the time he was grown, his verses were already whispered in taverns, recited in temples, and etched into walls by admirers who copied them in secret. I had become a voice of the people, a chronicler of suffering, weaving hope into lines that ordinary men carried like prayers. And this was precisely why his love for the queen was so dangerous. He was not just a man in love, he was a man whose words already held power. A soldier could be killed, a noble could be exiled, but a a poet's death only sharpened his memory. Some chronicles claim that the queen had read his work long before they ever met, that his lines had reached her chambers years before fate placed them in the same garden. If true, then their love was not born in sudden glances, but in words that had already lived inside her heart. Others whisper that the poet was more than a servant, that he had once been promised a position as royal scribe, a role denied to him after the fall of his family. If so, then every verse he wrote was not just about longing it, was about reclaiming a place in history that had been stolen from him. To the king, this backstory only deepened the threat. A queen's love was dangerous enough, but the love of a queen for a man who represented the people's voice was rebellion hidden in poetry. The punishment then was not just personal, it was political. By cutting out his tongue, the king hoped to silence more than one man. He hoped to silence the very idea that words could stand against power. But the plan backfired. For the poet's silence became louder than his speech, and the queen's quiet defiance turned his backstory into something greater than tragedy. It became destiny. The king thought he had ended a scandal. He believed by silencing the poet and warning the queen he had sealed the story behind palace walls. But kings often forget that walls cannot hold whispers. And whispers, when repeated often enough, turn into thunder. In the streets, the silent poet became a symbol. Children drew his likeness in the dust, his scarred mouth, his eyes burning with sorrow. Farmers passed his verses in secret, reciting them as blessings before planting their fields. Lovers carved his lines into trees, swearing that their devotion would not be silenced as his had been. Even the soldiers who once carried out the king's orders began to soften. Some confessed, in hushed tones, that when they struck him down, they felt they had struck at something greater than flesh. To serve a crown was duty. To kill a voice of truth was shame. The queen's subtle defiance added fire to the tale. Though she never openly rebelled, her silence toward the king and her quiet gazes toward the poet spoke louder than any words. Rumors claimed she smuggled food to him, that she touched his scarred lips in secret, that she mourned him though he still breathed. Whether true or not, the people wanted to believe it, and belief can topple thrones. The king responded with fear disguised as fury, ordered harsher punishments for those who recited the poet's lines. Books were searched, taverns raided, songs banned. Yet with every decree, the story only grew. Soon, even foreign lands began to whisper of the silent poet. Travelers carried his tale across borders, painting him as a martyr of forbidden love. Kings and other courts mocked the ruler who had been so threatened by words that he resorted to mutilation. The story became too large, too wild to contain. And then came the turning point. During a festival, when the streets filled with musicians, one dared to sing again the forbidden verse. Her silence is louder than the throne's decree. The crowd erupted in applause, not out of defiance, but out of hunger for truth, for beauty, for something beyond fear. The guards rushed forward, but they could not arrest everyone. Too many voices were already raised. The king's control was crumbling. His act of cruelty had not erased the poetry, had multiplied him. For every tongue he cut, 100 others spoke. And at the center of it all stood the queen, forced to live between crown and heart. The people now looked to her as the one who might finally shatter the silence completely. Would she dare, or would she too be broken by the throne? The palace courtyard filled again, just as it had on the day of his punishment. But this time there were no chains, no blades, no cries of fear. Only silence. The silent poet, weakened by years of confinement, was led forward. His body was thin, his steps slow, yet his eyes remained steady. Word had spread that the king, under pressure from unrest and whispers of rebellion, would finally present him to the court. Some expected execution, others mercy. What they received was neither. The queen entered first. Her gown shimmered in the torchlight, but her face was pale, carved by sorrow. She took her seat beside the king, though every line of her body seemed to resist the throne. When her eyes found the poet's, a hush swept the crowd. It was not the look of ruler to servant, nor of captive to captor. It was the look of two souls bound by suffering. The king rose and spoke of loyalty, of obedience, of the dangers of disobedience. His words were sharp, but they fell flat. For in that courtyard, no one listened to the crown. They watched the queen, and they watched the poet. Then something happened that history remembers not as rebellion, but as reverence. The poet, unable to speak, lowered himself to the ground and pressed his forehead to the stone. It was not an act of surrender, but of devotion, not to the king, but to the queen. The crowd understood. They, too, fell silent. No cheers, no cries, no chants. Only a stillness that carried more weight than thunder. In that silence, respect was louder than rebellion. The king, for all his power, looked small. Just a man sitting on a throne that trembled beneath the weight of silence. The queen, her eyes glistening, stood, and though she did not speak, she stepped down from her seat, crossed the courtyard, and placed her hand gently on the poet's scarred face. A gesture forbidden, a gesture undeniable. Gasps rippled through the court. For in that single act, she broke the wall between crown and heart. She gave him dignity where the king had tried to strip it away. She gave him back his humanity, even if only for a fleeting moment. The king said nothing. Perhaps rage bound his tongue, or perhaps he realized that any word spoken against what had just happened would only deepen his defeat. And so the climax was not marked by war, nor fire, nor rebellion. It was marked by silence. A silence that honored the poet more than any song ever could. From that day forward, the king's crown seemed heavy. His authority weakened, while the silent poet's legend grew beyond the palace, beyond the kingdom, beyond death itself. The silent poet did not live long after that final moment in the courtyard. His body, weakened by punishment and years of confinement, could not carry him further. But death did not end his story, it set it free. When news of his passing spread, the people did not mourn with cries. They mourned with silence. Markets grew quiet for an hour. Farmers bowed their heads in their fields. Children pressed their fingers to their lips. In every corner of the kingdom, silence became a form of rebellion. A tribute to the man who had once been punished for words, but who in the end became louder without them. The queen, history tells us, never spoke of him again. She could not. To mention his name would have been treason. But those who served close to her swore she carried his memory in small gestures, a pressed flower kept hidden in her chambers, a ribbon she refused to part with, the way her eyes sometimes wandered to the gardens where they first exchanged glances. The king ruled on, but his crown was never the same. It silenced a man but lost his people. Every decree he issued, every law he proclaimed was met with quiet resistance. For in every silence, the people remembered the poet. And so the legend grew. Its verses, preserved not on paper but in memory, traveled across generations. They were whispered in the dark by lovers who could not be together. They were sung softly by those who longed for freedom. They were carried across borders, reshaped, retold, but always with the same core. A man who loved a queen, a man punished for daring, a man who lost his tongue but gained eternity. Some say his ghost still lingers in the palace gardens, not weeping, not raging, but watching in silence. Others believe that when lovers carve words into stone or tree bark, they are continuing his work, ensuring his voice never dies. But perhaps the greatest legacy is this: he proved that words cannot be destroyed, even when the tongue is cut. Truth cannot be erased, even when kings demand silence. And love is the one force that survives every punishment, every crown, every grave. The silent poet's story is not just about cruelty. It is about endurance. It is about how silence itself can become the loudest cry of all.
Yeah.
And so, though his name is lost to history, his legend remains. A nameless man who loved a queen, a voiceless poet who spoke louder than a king. His silence still echoes,